Hi, my name is Jason. I am founder of FounderoftheDay.com, where I write daily articles on the American Revolution and the more obscure revolutionaries who helped make the founding of America possible. Today we're going to continue our series on underappreciated founding fathers, and we're going to look at someone who, surprisingly, is not nearly as famous as the Washingtons and Jeffersons and Franklins, even though he played just as big a role. And this is Robert Morris, who is up there with John Dickinson, who I did the last video on, who are just the two most underappreciated founding fathers. Robert Morris was a merchant in Pennsylvania when the war broke out, and he was one of, if not the, but one of the wealthiest people in the American colonies. And he ended up using that vast wealth to basically finance the American Revolution, which is, again, is why it's so surprising we don't hear more about him. So Morris is there when the revolution starts. He's angry about things, as most merchants were, but wasn't really overly revolutionary. He was not at the First Continental Congress, but he did get sent to the Second Continental Congress. And right off the bat, Morris was one of those people, with John Dickinson, who, when the time came to vote for independence, actually voted against independence. And his reasons were similar to Dickinson's, which were, before we have independence, we should have a government to replace it with, because we don't want to not have any government, and we should secure some foreign alliances to make sure we can both win the war and fund the war. He was a money man, and paying for things was his jam. Lo and behold, he does absent himself from the vote on independence. However, he was one of the few people, the only one from Pennsylvania, one of the few delegates to the Continental Congress who did not get recalled when he abstained from voting for independence. And therefore, 2 months later, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, he sat down and he signed it. And I have a quote here I'd like to read, which indicates the type of person Morris was. And right after the signing of the Declaration, he said, "I am not one of those politicians that run testy when my own plans are not adopted. I think it is the duty of a good citizen to follow when he cannot lead." And therefore, even though he was significantly outvoted on independence, he is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And he spent the next several years not fighting for that independence, financially fighting for that independence. He used his vast fortune to help create banks and support the Continental, which was the currency of the Continental Congress, which wasn't very valuable. He kept it afloat. He helped to pay for the soldiers. He helped to pay for the supplies. He helped to pay for the American Revolution. There were other people involved, most notably Gouverneur Morris, who was unrelated, and Chaim Solomon, who was one of the few Jewish founding fathers. The three of them worked very closely together to make it happen, but Morris was in charge. In fact, after the Articles of Confederation were signed, which Morris also signed, after those were signed, he became Minister of the Marine, or not Minister, Secretary of the Marine, and Secretary of Finance, which today we would consider Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of Treasury. He held both of those positions simultaneously from 1781 till 1784, really through the end of the war. So not only was he financing the revolution, but he was organizing the fight at sea and the monetary fight, which is an important part of any war, overlooked part of any war, but a very important part of any war. He resigns after peace is officially established to try and recoup some of the business he had lost, because he lost a lot of it. And then in 1787, when the Continental Congress is called in Philadelphia, Morris is elected to attend. And just to give you some perspective on the respect that was had by all of the founders for Robert Morris, when they showed up to the Continental Congress, the question was, who's going to be president or chairman of the convention? And in hindsight, it's easy for us to look back and say, oh yeah, definitely George Washington, clearly George Washington. But at the time, it was not so clearly George Washington. It was, is it Washington or is it Robert Morris? And when they showed up and it was time to elect, the first thing you do is elect a chairman, because that's how you operate a body of that nature. The first person to rise was Robert Morris. and Robert Morris nominated George Washington, putting an end to any kind of debate as to if Washington was the guy. And this is a very important moment because, Washington was not only chairman of that, but again, in hindsight, very clearly Washington should be the first president. But had Morris not already conceded to Washington, basically conceded him the position, there might have been a little more fight 2 years later when we're voting for our first president. Robert Morris then participates in the Constitutional Convention and signs the United States Constitution. So he's got his name on the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. Pretty shortly thereafter, Washington asks Morris to become Secretary of the Treasury, like he had done a decade earlier during the Revolution. And Morris says, no, I'm kind of broke right now. I'm doing a little bit of work. And Robert Morris recommended Alexander Hamilton take the position. And Washington knew and loved Hamilton and very much respected Robert Morris. And therefore he did, obviously, went with Alexander Hamilton. Robert Morris wasn't done. He was an inaugural member of the United States Senate, representing Pennsylvania, of course. So he was one of that initial crew to set all the precedents in the Senate. Unfortunately, Morris, in an attempt to recoup his fortune, not that he was ever dead broke, but to recoup his fortune, he invested wildly in speculation, mostly in land, a lot of it in upstate New York, but western Pennsylvania, in the Ohio region, just tried to buy a lot of land. And unfortunately, it didn't all work out for him. He ended up going very, very broke. And actually, just around the time that Jefferson took over as president, Robert Morris actually went to debtor's prison. And at the time, there were no bankruptcy laws. And all the other founders were like, oh man, what do we do? We can't put him in prison. It's Robert. And so some of the initial bankruptcy laws in the United States of America were created more or less to get Robert Morris out of prison. There were other people in poor situations, and bankruptcy laws had to happen, just like there were copyright laws happening in the early stages, things of that nature. But at that point, he quietly removed to his country estate and lived out his days quietly. But again, just to reiterate, Robert Morris was one of the most important creators of the United States of America. Everything from declaring independence, though clearly played a smaller role in that, to creating the Articles of Confederation, to paying for the war, to supplying the army, to building the initial finances of the Revolution, to overseeing the Navy, to nominating George Washington as the chairman of the Constitutional Convention. And he deserves much more appreciation than he gets. His name should be splattered across towns and counties and cities all around the United States. He does have a good amount of roads named after him. You might have seen some Morris Streets, or Morris Roads, or Morris Avenues. There's a fairly good chance it's him. And that's all we got for today. So please like and subscribe the video. If you want to see more, you hit the notification button. It'll let you know when I'm publishing. I'm not sure what my schedule is yet. This is all still very new to me. I hope to publish more and more and more about many, many underappreciated founding parents of the United States of America. Thank you. You have a great afternoon.